Well, it's lovely to sit down with two former Prime Ministers, like-minded countries, obviously, with our shared challenges, but plenty of opportunities. And I think both having served as Prime Ministers on the centre-right, I'm also keen to explore some of the challenges that conservative politics, centre-right politics is facing around the world. Liz, I'll start with you because you're in Australia at a momentous time. We've just commemorated 12 months on from the atrocities of October 7 and they're being felt obviously all around the world still today. But it's been a real challenge for cohesion in Australia. I'd be keen on your observations since you've been here about how we're handling division so far away in our own country.
I think we're facing similar issues in Britain that I see in Australia, which is, people should be commemorating the appalling events of October the 7th, but we've seen it tried to be hijacked for protest, and some people even claiming that those appalling events didn't happen. And I think it's part of a broader issue that people within our own societies in places like Australia or the United Kingdom are questioning the very basis of our values and our civilization. How on earth can they be protesting in favour of regimes that stone people, stone gay people, at the same time as advocating transgender ideology? It doesn't make any sense. So I think it's this questioning of our values that I find so worrying, because my view is what's made Australia great, what's made Britain great, is a belief in freedom, democracy, individual liberty, and that's the opposite of what we saw at those appalling events in Israel.
Is that because we've given up on integration, do you think? When we've brought migrants in, we've given up on demanding that they adopt our values?
Well, I think the left have been very successful at pursuing socialism by different means. And whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement or the transgender ideologues, they're basically saying the way we've lived our lives, our belief in families, individuals, the nation state, is somehow something to be ashamed of. And instead, those things are old-fashioned, they're part of history, and we need to move forward with this identity agenda. It's all about which group you're in, it's not about your individual talents and your individual capabilities. And I think that culture we have allowed, even though in Britain we've had a Conservative government for the last 14 years, we've seen these things be taught in our schools. The idea that you can become a woman if you're a man, if you just don't like your gender. The idea that the British history is something to be ashamed of, and instead, we need to. All cultures are equal. There's no difference between what's going on the streets of Iran and what's going on the streets of Birmingham, which is completely ludicrous. And I think too many people on the right have said, well, we don't want to be on the wrong side of history, so we don't want to fight back against those arguments. We need to just accept that the world has changed. And I think that's completely wrong. I think we're actually destroying our societies from within, and we're also projecting weakness towards regimes like Iran and Russia and China, because they think, well, if people on the streets of Britain are campaigning in favour of Hamas, then they don't believe in themselves anymore. And that encourages them to attack Israel or invade Ukraine.
One of the things that has been picked up here in the media, obviously, was congratulatory messages from Hezbollah to protesters in Australia. Hezbollah was noticing what was happening on the streets of Melbourne and Sydney in particular. And then we obviously have a parliamentary motion that fails to be able to bring the two major parties of government together to condemn what occurred just on 12 months ago. Now, you're a long-time observer of politics, Tony Abbott. Did you think we'd ever be in a situation where the Parliament, the two major parties of the Parliament, could not agree to condemn terrorism?
Well, I never thought, Peter, that we'd be in a situation where people would be even-handed as between a liberal democracy, Israel, and an apocalyptic death cult, Hamas. And yet there are obviously people in our country, quite a lot of people it seems in our country, judging by the number of protesters over the last 12 months, who are on the side of the apocalyptic death cult, Hamas, as opposed to the liberal democracy, Israel. And for all sorts of reasons, our government appears to be ambivalent as well. Now, I know that they're worried about the Muslim vote, in inverted commas, in some seats in Western Sydney, but in the end, leadership has got to be about doing what is right, not doing what is merely politically convenient. And the job of politicians is to manage the affairs of the country in accordance with a set of values and principles, to nudge the country in a better direction in accordance with your principles and values. And that's what I think the centre-right has sometimes lost in recent times. We've gone with the flow rather than created a contest of ideas and created a clear contest with the other side.
It wasn't so long ago that you were Prime Minister dealing with Islamic State. There was no celebration of Islamic State. You had no issues getting Labor to support tougher terrorism legislation. Now that's a handful of years. What's changed in Australia?
Well, I think that we've had more years of indoctrination, lefty indoctrination in our education system. We've had more years of uncontrolled legal immigration without a stress on being part of Team Australia once you're here. And I think just at the moment we've got a government which is conflicted because, as I said, they can't seem to decide whose side they're on. And that was why the motion in the Parliament yesterday or this week was so wishy-washy and on the one hand and on the other hand. Well, again, in any existential dispute between a terrorist group on the one hand and a functioning liberal democracy under the rule of law, there's no contest. You've got to be on the side of the State of Israel.
Do you think the West, Liz, is ashamed of Western values? Have we lost confidence in the West?
So I don't think the majority of people in Britain or Australia have lost confidence in the West or their countries. I think most normal people who live in towns and cities across the United Kingdom believe in Britain. They want our country to be successful. They're patriots. I think the problem is the establishment in our countries has moved to the left. And what do I mean by that? I mean the civil service and the bureaucracy, major corporations,
the universities,
a lot of the media. They've moved to the left significantly, and the left have been very successful at capturing those institutions. If you look at issues like climate alarmism, you know, it's completely been pushed everywhere, and it's unacceptable to say anything. It's unacceptable to be in favour of gas or fracking or even nuclear, I'm hearing here in Australia. Likewise, using pronouns and all of these things have infiltrated the establishment. I think one of the issues Conservatives have is understanding that we are no longer the parties of the establishment. We're actually the parties of the people, the vast majority of people who are patriotic, who want to work hard, who want to have a nice car, who want to go on holiday. Those are our supporters. We're no longer going to win over the liberal elites. And those are the people who are, alongside Islamists. Those are the people going on the protests. The people in Extinction Rebellion who are gluing themselves to the motorway in Britain. They're not poor people, they're rich people with trust funds.
So do you think the Tory party gets that? That the party machine gets that?
In a word, no.
No.
No. And that is our problem, and this is why at the 2024 election we were decimated. We weren't decimated because Keir Starmer was popular. He only got 34% of the vote. His premiership so far has been an utter disaster. But we were decimated because the vote on the right was split between the Conservatives and Reform. And the reason that Nigel Farage was able to make such inroads is Conservatives are left office with the highest immigration in 40 years, the highest taxes in 70 years, and people felt that wokery, sort of human rights culture had infected our country, and Conservatives hadn't done enough to stand up to it. So it was a rejection of Conservatives rather than a positive vote for Keir Starmer. But we now have this very difficult issue that the right is split. And I think some of the recent opinion polls have Reform on 20% and Conservatives on 24%. So we're looking like a replay unless we get our act together.
And a lot of this is similar here, isn't it?
Look, it is, Peter. And part of the difficulty is that our centre-right party, the Liberal Party, it's still run out of the rich, leafy inner suburbs, and yet increasingly its vote is in the aspirational working suburbs, if you like, of Western Sydney and Melbourne.
Made you Prime Minister.
Correct, and it's those areas that made Boris Johnson Prime Minister. So look, we need to better reflect the aspirations, the values and the instincts of the people who want to vote for us and do vote for us when we create a clear contest of ideas. And as Liz was saying, we should be the patriotic parties. We should be the parties that, sure, we believe in freedom, yes, we believe in tradition, but above all else, we believe in our countries. We think they are the best countries in the world to live, and we want to keep them that way. Now, I think that the vast majority of Britons, the vast majority of Australians are instinctively proud, and they can't understand why their leaders are so apologetic and constantly accommodating all these others who, frankly, don't seem to have been as successful in their countries. So why are we constantly bending over backwards to appease them? And I think this is part of the difficulty. I mean, Boris Johnson won a mighty victory on Brexit, and yet there was still this agonising over the European Convention on Human Rights, which was stopping the Conservative government from a proper border protection policy and stopping the boats in the English Channel.
But this goes to Liz's point. I mean, it's one thing to win office. It's another thing to do something with the power you have to actually make a difference according to your values.
We've been in office but not in power because
so how do you
the
deal?
civil service have been
Well, just on that, how do you deal then with these captured institutions?
But I think there are two problems in Britain. One is that not enough Conservative MPs were prepared to vote for the policies that would have transformed the country, because people voted for change. They voted for change in 2016 when they voted for Brexit. They voted again for change when they voted for Boris in 2019. But we didn't remove the EU laws off the statute books. We didn't deal with the Human Rights Act so that we could stop illegal immigration. Taxes went up. We didn't do fracking. And the reason we didn't do a lot of those things is Conservative MPs weren't prepared to vote for them. There's probably about a third of the parliamentary party that were prepared to vote for those things, because many of the parliamentary party are still of the old mindset, which is the people who are our voters are the establishment. We don't want to upset them. We don't want to say these nasty things about the ECHR. We don't want to get on with fracking because the people we meet at dinner parties love the environment and they're very concerned about net zero and they care about COP26. So that was what was going on in the party. But I think at the same time, the bureaucracy in Britain got very, very powerful under Tony Blair. So you need an even stronger parliamentary party to actually repeal all the laws that put that bureaucracy in place. And again, Conservatives weren't prepared to take that bureaucracy on. I mean, that's what I tried to do when I was Prime Minister in 2022, is take on the Office of Budget Responsibility and the Bank of England, who'd presided over a stagnant economy. But what I found was they were able to blame me for their failings, and in many cases Conservative MPs went along with that because they weren't prepared to take on these very powerful independent institutions. And my view is until we're prepared to do that, we're not going to be able to enact Conservative policies. Because every single area of the British government, whether it's the Migration Advisory Council, the Climate Change Committee, there are all these independent bodies staffed by leftists. They just don't want to. They don't want to play ball.
And you had some experience of this too. Some policy areas where it was very difficult to make change, or it would be a multi-term project. How do we around the centre right around the world tackle the issue of institutions? Because it's not just in the UK and it's not just in Australia.
Well, we have to first of all appreciate that the modern establishment is not a conservative establishment, it's a green left establishment. So we have to accept that the system is going to tend to work against us rather than for us. And then we've got to be prepared to just wear them down with better argument and more persistence. And one of the most disappointing things about contemporary Australian politics is that we haven't been prepared to tackle the educational system, which is in many ways at the heart of the difficulty. Now, I know that under David Cameron, when Michael Gove was the Education Secretary, a lot of good things happened with charter schools and things like that in Britain. We haven't had anything comparable thus far in Australia. We haven't had any of the state coalition governments, for instance, make a much more rigorous, much more parent-influenced school system a real crusade for them. But something like that is at the heart of long-term change for the better, and rediscovering faith in our country is very much at the heart of long-term change for the better. And this is why one of the things that I hope will happen if there is a change of government here in Australia at the next election is that we will only fly the one flag that represents all of us. We will not begin all civic events with an acknowledgement that the country belongs more to some people than to others, because while these at one level are small things, they help to shape a mindset. And in the end, we have got to be one proud, cohesive country that is going forward together, not as a kind of collection of mini nations.
With a bit of distance now from the Brexit decision, have you got Brexit done in the UK?
No, not fully. We've still got all of the EU laws on our statute books. So everything that was stopping us doing things in Britain, you know, the Natural Habitat Directive that means you can't build anything because there might be a bat there, or the Working Time Directive that tells Brits how much time a week they're meant to work. You know, all of those things are still in place in Britain. So we've been reluctant to do the big things that would actually change our country. And I think the right have to be really prepared to explain how powerless politicians have become. It's very difficult for a politician to say, actually, I wasn't able to take that decision because it's been outsourced to bureaucrat X or body Y, but I think we need to explain that to get the mandate from the public to return those powers to Parliament. Because every single department, and I worked in 6 different government departments, I would find an awful lot of the decisions were not in my hands. You know, they'd been handed to Natural England, or they'd be handed to the Judicial Appointments Commission, or the Bank of England, or the Office of Budget Responsibility. There are more than 500 of these bodies in Britain. I actually think Britain is worse than Australia. I think we've gone down that route. Yeah. And I think what has happened in Britain should be a warning to Australia, because we have hit complete stagnation, and also just an inability to govern ourselves. Apart from Keir Starmer being useless, he also just doesn't actually have the levers to do the things he needs to do. And you know, sometimes when Donald Trump talks about draining the swamp,
there's a resonance.
It does actually get the message across to people that the problem is the DC bureaucracy as much as it is the politicians. I think we've got to start explaining that to people.
You're right, Liz. I mean, the only reason why the Abbott government was able to stop the boats was because it was something that the executive government could do. That we could command the armed forces. We didn't need the Senate to agree. We didn't need the states to agree. And given that it was only Commonwealth public servants sitting around the table, I could say to them, look, I'm sorry, I hear what you've said. I've heard all your reservations. I've heard all your anxieties. but we are going to stop these damn things.
Just on that, I think we saw with COVID a lot of politicians taking the advice and running with the advice of departments, not getting the advice, considering the advice and making an independent decision. And this goes to Liz's point. Yes, these powers have been devolved into the bureaucracy, but also I think we've lost the politician with the bravery to lead and take some tough decisions, bold decisions, maybe occasionally wrong decisions, but not be scared of taking a punt.
In the end, it's got to be the elected and the accountable politicians who are in charge. Now, okay, there are some highly technical things where maybe you do have to follow some expert advice, but generally speaking, there's got to be absolute clarity about who's in charge. And I used to cringe every time I would hear politicians during the pandemic stand up and say, we are following the expert advice, because the expert advice would change from day to day and from place to place. And in the end, the experts might know more in a technical sense, but that doesn't mean their judgment is better. And in the end, these things are all questions of value judgments. Is it more important to lock people up or keep them free? That's a value judgment in the end, and it's got to be something that's made by someone who is elected and accountable.
We're all watching the biggest race in the world at the moment, the US presidential election, about a month to go. I know that you're close with the Trump camp. I mean, what are your observations here?
Well, I think this race is vitally important. I fear another 4 years of the Democrats in the White House. I think Kamala Harris is continuity Joe Biden. And what we have seen is we have seen appeasement and capitulation to our enemies. Whether it's China, whether it's Russia, or whether it's Iran. Why is Iran able to sponsor terrorist organisations? Biden took the sanctions off Iran on the basis they would strike a deal on nuclear proliferation. In fact, Iran is almost at the point of getting a nuclear weapon. And at every single juncture, America has projected weakness. I mean, I was involved at the tail end of the Afghanistan withdrawal. They failed to work with our allies. They signalled to Putin that they weren't prepared to stand up to aggression. And the domestic policies in the US have also been very bad for people, reversing the tax cuts, stopping new oil and gas. I mean, it's still a better situation than Britain. In Britain, we have the highest energy prices in the developed world. It is killing our economy. The last steel works in Britain, the last blast furnace has just closed down.
Oil
refinery is closed down. But what I'm seeing in America is the same things that started happening in Britain 5 or 10 years ago are now happening in the US. And I worry that the strongest economy in the world, the most powerful free democracy, is currently under leadership that doesn't value Western civilization and is not just appeasing the likes of Iran and Russia, but also appealing the Islamist separatists in America, appeasing the transgender activists, appeasing the climate extremists who just want to shut everything down. And I think 4 years of that is going to be an absolute disaster. Conversely, if Trump gets in, I think it'll have a very positive effect on countries like the UK and Australia if we see the US motoring ahead.
Tony?
Look, I often used to say that politics wasn't a choice between good and great or even between good and bad. Sometimes it was a choice between bad and worse. People would often look at me and say, yeah, we get that. But the leader of the free world, because that's what the US president is, has got to be capable of standing up to the enemies of the free world. And whatever faults Donald Trump might have, whatever mistakes Donald Trump might have made, we know from his previous time as president that he was capable of standing up to the West's enemies. I think we are in the middle of a civilizational struggle. I think too many of us are oblivious to it. But in a civilisational struggle, you've got to know whose side you're on. And this can't be a managerial exercise. This isn't a split the difference business. It's a business where you win or you lose, and we have got to make sure that our countries and our values emerge strong and victorious.
And we were talking earlier about the problems of the bureaucracy in Britain. I see those same problems in the United States. I've worked with the State Department. I know there are deeply embedded attitudes that are not, pursuing the right policies with regard to China, Russia and Iran. And I think you do need a character like Donald Trump, controversial though he is, to actually take on those forces. Because there are lots of good, rational politicians, but what we're dealing with is not the old left-right battle. It's not a bit of tax here, a bit of spend here. It's people who literally want to destroy our countries, are embedded in our governments, and they need to be taken on. And that's why I do think President Trump has the ability the fearlessness to take them on.
You make a good point, Liz. I mean, in the old days, the Marxists just wanted to destroy the economy. Now they want to destroy society. And they've been more effective, let's face it, in persuading the middle class to revolt against the patriarchy and to crusade for saving the economy, even if it does, saving the planet, even if it does mean destroying the economy, than they ever were at persuading the working class to go for equality.
I'll come back to that, but I want to just touch on China before we leave this geopolitical chat, because as troubling as the Middle East is, as troubling as Russia in its invasion of Ukraine is, the real global player here is China. It took Britain a long time to wake up to China. I think your eyes are open, and I put it down to perhaps geography.
I think it took all of us a long time to wake up.
It's true, but I think there was a whole discussion, remember, about whether you would put Huawei into your network.
I don't think Britain is fully... We haven't done enough on China. There's still far too much influence in British universities. We have huge numbers of overseas students. We've recently had the Labour government in Britain reversing a law on free speech, allegedly due to pressure from the Chinese authorities, because the universities wanted the money from overseas students. There's a lot of pressure. I saw this when I was in government, from the Treasury, to not close down routes from investment from China, to do more trade with China, because they saw it as boosting the economy in the short term. And I think there needs to be much more coordination from Western powers to take on China economically, as well as make sure we're properly prepared in defence terms. And at present, what I see is every European country, the EU, they're all going to China on business missions, trying to get more investment. They still haven't really understood the threat China poses. And China is now working with Iran and Russia. These are not separate conflicts going on in different parts of the world. China are breaking the sanctions. They are helping make sure that Russia has the supply of weapons they need against Ukraine. And we need to view it as an overall challenge of the authoritarian axis. And the West needs to work much more closely together than it is at the moment.
And of course, at the time of all of this for Australia, we've never been as degraded militarily as we are now.
We've made ourselves too dependent on friends who we can't always rely on, and we've made ourselves too vulnerable to antagonists who we know want to change the world for the worse. And whether it's Britain not being able to itself authorise the Ukrainians to use Storm Shadows because they're dependent upon Americans for the targeting, that's a problem. Or whether it's Australia still having Chinese componentry in our vital supply chains and so on. Whatever it is, there's got to be more self-reliance. Now, this is not an anti-market position. I am pro the market, but the market is not the only thing. And if you are going to be a sovereign, independent country, there are some things that you've got to be able to do yourself.
And it's not really a market when China is using state subsidies to undermine companies overseas, and they're using it for industrial espionage. It is not a genuine market, and they have been able to just flout World Trade Organization rules for years and years and years and get away with it.
Let's just talk about the health of the centre-right and the health of political parties going forward. I mean, we can all talk about how critical a strong centre-right is to the West, but what happened with young people and attracting them to look at the centre-right as the government of the future? And one of the challenges you have is to modernise the party to be attractive to young people but keeping hold of its values. And the left have ownership of all the language, the pejoratives of language are on the centre-right.
It hasn't always been that way, Peter. I mean,
so how do you speak to modern Conservatives now, Tony?
If you go back to the times of successful centre-right governments, the Thatchers, the Reagans, the Howards, we got a very strong youth vote, or a comparatively strong youth vote, because there was the pride in the country, which I think most people instinctively have and want to show. But if we are diffident and apologetic, well then it's very hard to inspire. You will only inspire people if they think you are serious and you believe this and it matters to you and you are prepared to fight for it.
Liz?
If you look at Britain, in fact, I think in the 18 to 24-year-olds, Reform are doing as well as Labour, particularly amongst young men. So there is evidence that young men in particular are frustrated about the situation of Britain and are voting for a party or advocating for a party on the right. The problem is that because Conservatives haven't been standing up for our beliefs, because we've essentially become technocrats, almost justifying the decisions made by the civil service, that's just not exciting for people. That's not something you get on board with. And young people have been turned off. And I think if you look at Canada and what Pierre Poilievre is doing, again, he is inspiring young people with true Conservative messages. So I don't believe the left only young. They don't. And actually, now we've got a left-wing government in Britain, people are realising how useless Labour is. I mean, part of the problem was every single issue, whether it was COVID or whether it was the war in Ukraine or the price of heating, everything could be blamed on the Conservatives. Now, the Labour government own the problem. So I do think there is an opportunity for the right, but we have to be exciting, forward-looking, visionary, and not just justifying ourselves, which is what we were doing.
What next for you?
Well, I've got my book out, 10 Years to Save the West. I'm doing a launch tomorrow with Tony here in Sydney. I'm very excited about that. But I care passionately about the future of Western civilization. I do think it is under threat. So I'm looking for any way that I can help make the case. And having spent 10 years as a government minister in Britain, I do understand what is wrong with the system and we need to change it. And unless we're prepared to do that, I don't think we'll be able to affect that change. So one of the things I want to do is explain to people why things aren't working at the moment and what we need to do to change it.
A lot of people say, Tony Abbott, that it feels like the 1930s, the late 1930s at the moment, and that's not just in a security sense, but right across the board. You look around the world, and I don't know where our Churchills are. How concerned are you about the climate we are in now, the threat of China, Xi's clear statements of intent? Are we awake to the threat that's real?
Well, the phrase that's been used by me amongst others is that we are sleepwalking through Lotus Land. I do think this is a civilisational moment. I do think that we are challenged externally and internally in a way never before. But I also think that any fair-minded judge would say that thanks to the long ascendancy of the West, the Pax Britannica succeeded by the Pax Americana, at least in 2020, the world was more safe, more fair, more free, more rich for more people than at any time in human history. So there is so much to be proud of, and we've got to build on our strengths rather than just disintegrate in decadence, which seems to be happening at the moment.
All right, just before we go, I've got to ask you, getting to the apex of politics in your country, and this is a question to both of you. As you left, is there something you wish you knew or better understood before you walked in that door at Downing Street, that famous black door the first time, before you walked into the office? I can't say the lodge because you never lived in the lodge. Is there something that, that the idea of writing a letter back to your 16-year-old self and things that you might have wished you would know, was there anything that struck you as you took on the biggest job in Britain?
I mean, I learned a hell of a lot during that short period, and I'd spent 10 years as a government minister. I'd had all the battles, fighting the bureaucracy, fighting the people that didn't want change, fighting the left. And I thought that when I got to the top, I would have the power to make the decisions that needed to be done. And what I discovered was a lot of those powers were illusory, that they were held elsewhere. So the big learning for me was about how much power has been taken away from the Prime Minister as part of Parliament in Britain. But I don't think you have to be there to learn that. I don't think it's something somebody could have told me in advance. Yeah. It was experiencing the way it worked that made me understand why it was that my predecessors hadn't done the things that they said they would do when they went into office. So I think one thing I had was a lot more sympathy for my predecessors not delivering on their promises when I understood just how difficult it had become to get things done.
Tony Abbott?
Look, Liz is absolutely right. One of the things that I discovered was just how constrained you were. I made assumptions about the Senate, which turned out not to be true. I made assumptions about the Liberal-run states, which turned out not to be true.
You mean believing you had a mandate and that they would honour the mandate?
So there's got to be a personnel plan as well as a policy plan these days. But look, it was an incredible honour to lead a party. It was an incredible honour to lead a country, and I savour every second of it. And I guess the one thing you do is, I suppose, look back with pride, and I dare say some regret, because there was always more that could be done.
Thank you both for your time.